My name is Elias Crow, and I took the Lighthouse post on Greymark Island because no one else would keep it longer than a season. That should have been the first warning, but isolation pays well when you don't ask why. The second warning came in the envelope taped to the inside of the lantern room door, the paper stiff with salt, the ink faded but deliberate, titled only as rules. I read them by the beam's slow sweep, the glass humming as it turned, the ocean below breathing in a way that felt measured, almost patient. The night I'm talking about began with weather that refused to commit. Fog slid in from the west, thin as gauze, then withdrew, then crept back thicker, swallowing the sound of the surf until the island felt unplugged from the world. The air smelled metallic, like old coins warmed in a pocket. The wind pushed against the tower in soft, testing pulses, not gusts, as if it were feeling for weak points. I checked the lamp pressure, wiped salt from the lenses, logged the hour. Routine steadies the hands. That's another rule, unwritten but understood. Greymark is a rock with a name. No harbor lights, no town glow. A single path snakes from the dock up to the tower, bordered by scrub grass that rattles when the wind shifts. The keepers' quarters sit low and squat, their windows blind to the sea. The lighthouse itself is old, the kind of old that creaks with intention. You can feel the weight of it through your boots, a steady downward insistence that makes you stand a little straighter. The beam began its patient rotation at sundown, a white slice cutting fog, returning every 20 seconds to remind me I was still here. Rule 1 was printed in bold. Keep the light on at all times after dusk. That one made sense. Rule 2 followed. Do not step outside between the first foghorn and the second. The horn had not sounded in years, according to the logbooks, but I noted it anyway. Rule 3 was stranger. If you hear footsteps on the stairs after midnight, remain in the lantern room until dawn. The stairs are narrow, iron spirals that sing when you climb them. I'd learned their voice. Anything else would stand out. At 9, the foghorn sounded once. It was low and close, not the distant moan I expected, but a breathy note that seemed to exhale from beneath the rocks. The sound pressed into my chest and stayed there, like a held breath. I checked the clock. Too early for midnight. The rules did not say what to do if the horn sounded early. I wrote it down. The ink bled slightly, as if the page were damp. By 10, the fog had thickened enough that the beam bounced back pale and diffuse, turning the lantern room into a floating circle of light. Every surface gleamed softly. The smell of oil and ozone mixed with salt until my tongue felt numb. I drank water and felt it sit heavy, cold. The island was quiet in a way that magnified small sounds. The glass ticked as it cooled. Somewhere below, a chain shifted once, then settled. Rule 4. Do not acknowledge voices carried on the wind. There was a note in the margin, the handwriting tight. They learn. I told myself it was superstition, the kind that grows in lonely places. Still, when the wind pressed its face to the tower and whispered something that could have been my name, I focused on the steady sweep of light and counted seconds. At 11, the foghorn sounded again, longer this time. The note climbed at the end, a questioning lilt that made the hairs on my arms rise. The sound carried upward through the tower's bones, setting the stairs humming in response. I waited for the echo to die. The rules said nothing about answering. They said nothing about listening. I listened anyway, because the absence afterward was louder than the horn had been. Midnight came without ceremony. The clock's tick grew loud enough to feel a pressure behind my eyes. Rule 5 was underlined twice. At midnight, check the ledger. Do not read past the current date. The ledger lay open on the desk, its pages thick and soft, corners rounded by decades of fingers. The entries were precise. Weather, visibility, maintenance. Names appeared occasionally, then stopped. I found tonight's date and saw it was already filled in. My handwriting stared back at me, neat and unfamiliar, describing the foghorn at 9 and 11, the metallic smell, the pressure in the air. The time at the bottom read 12:07. My watch said 12:01. I closed the book without turning the page. Rule 6. If the ledger is ahead, stop writing. The lantern room felt smaller then, the glass closer. The beam swept, returned, swept again. Outside, something moved through the fog with purpose. I couldn't see it, but the light changed when it passed, bending as if around a shape that refused to be outlined. Footsteps sounded on the stairs at 12:15. Slow, deliberate. The iron sang a note that wasn't quite right, a pitch I hadn't heard before. Rule 3 came back to me, clear and heavy. Remain in the lantern room until dawn. I stepped away from the door, the beam's glow warming my face. The footsteps climbed 2 steps, then paused. A hand brushed the railing, the sound dry, like skin on rust. Rule 7. If you smell earth after midnight, close the vents. The scent rose suddenly, rich and damp, out of place in a room that tasted of salt. I crossed to the vents and shut them, my fingers slick. The smell lingered anyway, threaded with something sweet and rotten. The footsteps resumed, then stopped just below the door. Rule 8 was short. Do not open the door. There was a mark beneath it, a half-moon pressed into the paper, as if someone had tried to puncture it and failed. I stood with my back to the glass, watching the fog swallow the beam and give it back, my breath loud in my ears. The footsteps retreated, not downward but sideways, as if the stairs had widened. Rule 9 was written smaller, as if added later. If the light fails, light the secondary. Do not look down. The lamp flickered then, just once, a shiver through the room. My stomach tightened. The pressure in the air increased, a hand on the crown of my head. Somewhere below, something knocked once, twice, testing. The night stretched thin and tight. I counted sweeps of the beam. I counted breaths. I did not look down. The foghorn did not sound again, but the island breathed all the same, patient and close, waiting for me to forget which rules were written and which were learned. The footsteps returned at 12:47, closer this time, the sound carrying weight I could feel through the soles of my boots. Each step settled into the iron with a patience that suggested familiarity, as if whoever climbed had learned the staircase by heart long before I ever arrived. The lantern room light continued its sweep, the glass breathing in and out with soft clicks, but the beam felt thinner now, stretched by the fog into something fragile. I stood still because stillness had become a kind of compliance. The rules weren't commands so much as boundaries, lines drawn to show where the island stopped tolerating you. I realized then that the rules assumed I would want to leave the lantern room. They assumed curiosity would push harder than fear. The pressure behind my eyes grew when the footsteps stopped again, directly below the door. Something shifted its weight. The sound was wrong for a human body, too distributed, like several points of contact deciding where to settle. The smell of earth thickened despite the closed vents. It wasn't soil from a garden or rain-soaked ground. It was deeper, mineral, the scent you get when something buried long enough to forget air suddenly remembers it exists. My tongue tasted copper. I swallowed and felt it scrape down. The door handle twitched once. Not a turn, just a test, like a knuckle brushing skin to see if there's a reaction. I stared at the ledger on the desk and thought about Rule 6 again. Stop writing. I hadn't written since midnight, but my eyes kept drifting to the book as if it might continue without me. The idea that it didn't need my hand anymore sat cold in my chest. Outside the glass, the fog parted briefly, enough to show the water directly below the tower. The sea looked flat, almost polished, reflecting nothing. No stars, no beam, just a dark surface holding its breath. I forced my gaze away before instinct could pull it downward. The rules didn't explain what would happen if I looked. They never did. They only described what not to do, which felt worse. A sound like breath slid under the door, slow and deliberate, timed with the sweep of the light. I focused on the rhythm. 20 seconds. Again. Again. The breath matched it as if listening. The island learned things too, I realized. Not just voices. At 1:15, the foghorn sounded a third time, closer than before, the note vibrating through the glass until my teeth hummed in sympathy. The sound didn't come from the sea this time. It came from the island itself, from the rock beneath the tower, a resonance that climbed the walls and settled in my bones. The footsteps retreated as the horn faded, but not down the stairs. They moved laterally again, circling, mapping the space beneath me. Rule 10 wasn't numbered. It was scribbled at the bottom of the page, almost lost in the margin. If you hear scratching, ignore it. The scratching began a minute later, faint at first, like nails worrying a seam. It moved, tracing the perimeter of the lantern room floor below, a careful exploration of joints and weaknesses. I pressed my palms to the glass and felt the cold bite through skin, grounding me in sensation that was mine. The scratching stopped abruptly. Silence rushed in to fill the space so complete it felt manufactured. My ears rang. In that quiet, I became aware of another sound. Water moving where it shouldn't. A slow, internal slosh like the island adjusting something deep inside itself. The pressure increased again, a gentle insistence downward. I bent my knees without realizing it, resisting an urge to crouch. The beam faltered at 1:32. Not a flicker this time, but a dip, the light thinning to a pale ghost before surging back. Rule 9 surfaced, heavy. Light the secondary. Do not look down. I moved to the cabinet by memory, fingers finding the latch. The secondary lamp smelled older, dustier. I lit it with hands that shook despite my efforts, keeping my eyes level, fixed on the far wall where Salt had traced pale maps over decades. When I turned back, the main beam had stabilized, but something about its sweep had changed. The light lingered longer on the fog to the north, as if caught, as if there were resistance there now. Each pass left a faint afterimage, a suggestion of outline that refused to resolve. My head ached with the effort of not interpreting it. At 2, the door handle turned slowly, deliberately, stopping just before it would have clicked. The pressure in the room spiked, my ears popping. A sound like a throat clearing came from the other side, followed by a voice that was almost mine. Not my voice exactly, but close enough that my stomach dropped in recognition. Said my name once, softly, like a reminder. Rule 4 burned bright. Do not acknowledge voices carried on the wind. This wasn't the wind, I thought, then corrected myself. On Greymark, everything is the wind eventually. I said nothing. The voice tried again, adjusting cadence, testing tones. It spoke fragments from the ledger, weather notes, times, details I hadn't told anyone. Each word felt placed with care, meant to hook attention and pull. The light continued its sweep, steady, indifferent. I counted seconds out loud in my head, using numbers like stepping stones. The scratching returned closer, above me this time. I froze, heart pounding, and then remembered the tower is only 1 room tall. The sound came from the glass, from the outside, something dragging itself along the curve, following the beam's path. Condensation bloomed where it passed, hand-shaped and wrong, fingers too long, joints too many. I kept my eyes forward, watching reflections blur and reform. At 3, the fog began to thin, not lifting but stretching, pulling itself into vertical strands that swayed without wind. The island smelled sharp, clean, like stone after a break. The voice fell silent. The footsteps stopped. The scratching faded. In their absence, the pressure eased slightly, enough for me to straighten. Dawn was still hours away. The rules didn't say the night would try only once. They never promised that. The quiet that followed felt provisional, like a pause held open by unseen hands. I stayed where I was, because movement had become a language and I didn't trust myself to speak it correctly. The beam continued its slow work, slicing fog into pale segments that drifted and recombined. Each pass revealed the same shapes and the same absence of anything that could be named. The island smelled clean now, stripped to stone and salt, and the pressure receded enough for my breathing to find a rhythm again. At 3:10, something knocked on the tower from the outside. Not the door, the stone. A single, measured impact, low and resonant, as if the island itself had tapped a finger to get my attention. I counted the seconds between sweeps and waited for the knock to repeat. Didn't. The sound left a memory in the walls, a hum that traveled upward through the spiral stairs and into the lantern room floor. I felt it in my teeth. The ledger lay closed on the desk, its presence a weight I refused to lift. Rule 6 had a way of asserting itself without ink. I focused instead on the gauges, on numbers that moved when you watched them long enough. Oil pressure steady, temperature dropping. The glass ticked again. A soft punctuation that made the room feel inhabited by something patient and mechanical. I told myself the rules existed to keep the light on. Everything else was noise. At 3:25, the fog parted farther than it had before, revealing the path from the dock. The stones were wet, reflective, empty. No footprints, no movement. The beam slid over it and moved on, returning 20 seconds later to confirm nothing had changed. That repetition was comforting until it wasn't. On the fourth pass, something new appeared at the edge of the light, just beyond the path, where the scrub grass bowed away from the rock. It wasn't a figure. It was an absence shaped like one. A place where fog refused to settle and light bent around a vertical space. The afterimage lingered even after the beam moved on. A ghost of contrast burned into my vision. I didn't stare. Staring felt like an invitation. I let the beam do the looking for me, counted, waited for the next sweep. The absence shifted between passes, not closer or farther, but different, as if trying on angles. My head throbbed with the effort of not assigning it a form. The rules never mentioned absences. They mentioned sounds, smells, pressure. They assumed you would see things and want to understand them. Understanding, I was learning, was optional. At 3:40, the foghorn sounded again, but this time it came from the tower itself. The sound poured out of the walls, a low exhale that vibrated the glass and set the secondary lamp trembling in its bracket. My chest tightened as the note climbed, then broke, like a breath forced through a narrowing throat. When it stopped, the island felt closer, compressed inward. The absence by the path vanished with the sound, replaced by something worse: alignment. The beam's sweep synchronized with a slow movement below, the fog drawing itself into a corridor that pointed directly at the tower. Each return of the light found the corridor straighter, clearer, a suggestion of direction where there should have been none. I tasted copper again and swallowed it down. Rule 11 surfaced unbidden, though I didn't remember reading it. Do not change the beam's speed. I checked the mechanism anyway, hands hovering, resisting the urge to intervene. The light wasn't misbehaving. It was doing exactly what it was built to do. That was the problem. At 4, the footsteps returned, but not on the stairs. They came from the keeper's quarters below, muffled by distance and stone. A chair scraped once. A door opened and closed with careful restraint. The sounds were domestic, ordinary, placed with a precision that made my skin crawl. I imagined the quarters as I'd left them at dusk, neat and spare, everything where it belonged. The idea that something had decided to move through that space as if it were familiar felt like a violation of a different kind. The smell of oil grew stronger, warm and sweet, then faded. The secondary lamp flickered, steadying again without intervention. The beam continued its sweep. The footsteps paused beneath the lantern room, then resumed, slower, heavier. I pressed my palms to the desk and felt the vibration through the wood. The pressure returned, gentle but insistent, like a hand guiding my chin downward. Do not look down. The words were no longer ink. They were sensation. I lifted my gaze to the horizon line where fog met nothing and held it there, breathing shallowly. The footsteps stopped directly beneath me. Something rested its weight against the underside of the lantern room. Testing. The iron complained softly. A sound like paper tearing came from below, followed by a wet, patient noise that made my stomach knot. The ledger shifted on the desk without my touching it. A fraction of an inch, then another. I stepped back, heart hammering, and watched as it slid open to tonight's date. The ink glistened as if fresh. New lines appeared, one after another, describing the fog corridor, the alignment, the footsteps in the quarters. The time at the bottom advanced on its own, minute by minute, matching the clock's tick. At 4:30, the pressure peaked. My ears rang. The beam slowed imperceptibly, or my perception did. The fog corridor brightened, the absence within it resolving into edges my brain refused to complete. I tasted earth again, deep and mineral, and felt the urge to open the vent's claw at my hands. I didn't. I stood in the center of the room, where the light washed over me and returned, over and over, a metronome of survival. The knocking returned, closer now, higher up the tower, a slow climb that wasn't footsteps and wasn't scratching. It was contact, repeated and deliberate, mapping the curve of the glass. Condensation bloomed again, but this time it formed symbols I almost recognized, shapes that tugged at memory without offering meaning. I kept my eyes on the beam's source, on the heart of the light where it was brightest and simplest. At 5, the fog began to thin for real. Not stretch, not align. Lift. The corridor dissolved into ragged threads that tore away from the rock and vanished. The pressure eased in increments, like a hand loosening its grip one finger at a time. The knocking slowed, then stopped. The footsteps faded. The ledger's ink dried, the page settling back into itself as if nothing had happened. Dawn didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in, a pale suggestion that softened the edges of the world. The beam continued its sweep until the light outside was strong enough to make it redundant. I let it run anyway because redundancy had become a comfort. When the sun finally cleared the fog, the island looked like a rock again. Just stone and scrub and sea. I didn't open the door until the light was fully on the water and the rules loosened their hold on my hands. When I did, the air smelled ordinary, cold and clean. The path from the dock was empty. The keeper's quarters were exactly as I'd left them. The ledger lay closed on the desk, tonight's page complete. At the bottom, beneath the time, a final line had been added in smaller script, almost an afterthought. You followed them. Morning light made the island look smaller than it felt at night. Graymark in daylight was a study in restraint. Flat stone, low grass, the sea behaving itself. I stood in the lantern room longer than necessary, letting the beam continue its sweep even as the sun rose high enough to dilute it. Turning it off felt like a decision, and decisions had become dangerous. Eventually, practicality won. I shut the lamp down in stages, logged the time with a hand that still shook, and listened to the tower settle into a different kind of quiet. The rules didn't say what to do after dawn. That omission felt intentional. I descended the stairs slowly, testing each step with my weight before committing. The iron sang its familiar notes again, the pitch corrected, as if whatever had learned it overnight had moved on. The keeper's quarters greeted me with stillness and the faint smell of old wood. Nothing had been disturbed. The chair stood where I'd left it. The kettle was cold. If something had moved through the space, it had done so with care. I ate without appetite, forcing down dry crackers and water. My body wanted routine, something to anchor to. Outside, the fog thinned to tatters and then vanished entirely, revealing a horizon line that felt too sharp after the soft uncertainty of the night. The sea resumed its ordinary rhythm. Gulls cried. The island returned to pretending it was just a place. By mid-morning, A launch appeared on the water, its engine a small, insistent noise that carried easily in the clear air. Supply day. I felt a flicker of relief that surprised me with its intensity. Company, even at a distance, meant witnesses. The launch tied up at the dock, and the quartermaster climbed out, moving with the easy familiarity of someone who had done this run many times. He looked up at the tower and squinted. "Light ran late," he called, voice carrying. "Everything all right?" I considered my answer carefully. Rule 4 echoed, though the wind had no part in this exchange. "Fog," I said finally. It was true enough. He nodded, already turning back to his manifest. We worked in companionable silence, hauling crates up the path. He chatted about weather farther out, about a delayed run last week. Ordinary words, ordinary concerns. Each sentence felt like a small kindness. As he left, he paused at the bottom of the path. "You get the rules?" he asked, casual. "Yes," I said. He smiled without humor. "Good. Folks who don't, they don't last." He hesitated, then added, "Don't take them personally." The launch pulled away, leaving the island quiet again. The day stretched long and uneventful. I checked the tower, cleaned lenses, did the small maintenance tasks that make a place feel manageable. The rules stayed folded in my pocket, their weight a constant reminder. I didn't read them again. Reading felt like inviting interpretation. Afternoon slid into evening with deceptive gentleness. The air cooled. Shadows lengthened. The sea darkened by degrees. I found myself watching the horizon more than necessary, measuring the light. When the sun touched the water, my stomach tightened. Habit had already taken hold. I climbed the tower before dusk, the stairs greeting me like an old acquaintance. The lantern room smelled of oil and salt and something else I couldn't name. I unfolded the rules and scanned them quickly, not for new information but for reassurance that they were still the same. They were. The scribbles in the margins looked older than I remembered. The ink faded to a soft gray. I wondered when they'd been written, and by whom. The beam came on as the sun slipped away, its first sweep cutting cleanly through clear air. The contrast unsettled me. No fog to soften edges, no ambiguity to hide in. The light traveled farther, revealing more of the island than it had the night before. Knowledge can be a kind of exposure. At 9, the foghorn sounded once. My pulse spiked despite the daylight memory of calm. The note came from the sea this time, distant and proper. I logged it. The ink behaved itself, soaking into the page without bleeding. The ledger felt inert, compliant. I kept my entries spare. As the night deepened, the air grew still. The wind died completely, leaving the island wrapped in a silence that felt deliberate. I became acutely aware of the sounds I made, the scrape of a chair, the click of a gauge. Each noise seemed to travel farther than it should have, bouncing back a fraction of a second later, as if reflected by something unseen. At 10, the fog returned. Not creeping, not sliding. It arrived all at once, a curtain drawn tight around the island. The beam met resistance immediately, diffusing into a pale halo that pressed back against the glass. The smell of metal returned, faint but unmistakable. I closed the vents before the earth scent could announce itself. My hands moved on their own, guided by memory more than thought. Midnight approached with a familiar pressure. The clock's tick grew loud again. I stood by the ledger, waiting for the moment the rules insisted on. When the minute hand clicked over, I opened the book and found the page blank. No handwriting, not even my own. Relief washed through me, followed by a sharp edge of disappointment I didn't like examining. Footsteps sounded on the stairs at 12:15, exactly as before. The iron sang the wrong note again, and my skin prickled in recognition. I stepped away from the door and watched the beam continue its work. The footsteps paused, then continued, then paused again, testing. The smell of earth seeped through anyway, finding its way into my lungs despite the closed vents. I swallowed and waited. This time, when the door handle twitched, it didn't stop short. Turned, slowly, deliberately, until the latch pressed tight. The pressure in the room spiked, and my vision tunneled. I leaned against the glass and focused on the cold, grounding myself in sensation. The rules had not changed. The night had. A voice slid through the crack beneath the door, not carried on the wind but shaped by the tower itself. It didn't say my name. It said something worse. Again. The word lingered in the room after it was spoken, not echoing so much as settling, like dust finding a surface. Again implied familiarity. Again assumed consent. I kept my mouth closed and my eyes forward, watching the beam shear fog into pale bands that refused to travel far. The glass hummed softly, a sound I'd come to associate with endurance rather than comfort. The handle eased back to neutral. The pressure ebbed a fraction. Footsteps withdrew 2 steps, then stopped. I counted sweeps. 20 seconds. Again. The smell of earth thickened anyway, threading through the oil and salt until my head felt heavy with it. I closed my eyes briefly, no rule against that, and opened them to find the fog pressed closer, the halo of light reduced to a tight ring that made the lantern room feel smaller. At one, the ledger rustled without wind. I didn't look at it. The rules had taught me the difference between seeing and acknowledging, and the space between them had become precious. The scratching began shortly after, faint and polite, tracing the seam where glass met iron. It wasn't aggressive. It was careful, as if the thing doing it had learned that force wasn't required. The scratching stopped. Silence returned, and with it the sense of being watched from multiple angles at once. Not eyes. Tension. The beam slowed, not in fact, but in feeling, as if time itself had thickened. I shifted my weight and felt the tower respond. A subtle sway that reminded me the structure was alive in its own way. At 1:30, the foghorn sounded twice in quick succession, then went quiet. The notes didn't carry far. They felt trapped, swallowed by the fog before they could stretch. The sound vibrated through the stairs, and from below came a soft reply, a resonance that wasn't a horn but knew its shape. The stairs sang back, wrong and low. The footsteps returned, but this time they climbed all the way to the door and stopped. No testing of the handle, no scratching, just presence, close enough that the air beneath the door felt warmer, damp. I focused on the beam's source, the brightest point in the room, and breathed shallowly. Do not open the door. The rule felt less like instruction now and more like a description of physics. Something pressed against the door, not pushing, just resting weight. The iron complained. The pressure in my head spiked again, and for a moment I had the absurd thought that if I lay down, if I matched the downward insistence, it might ease. I didn't. I stood where the light washed over me and returned, over and over. A sound like a page turning came from the desk. I didn't look. The voice spoke again, not from the door this time but from everywhere at once, shaped by the curve of the glass and the hollow of the stairs. It didn't use my name. It used the islands. Greymark. The syllables slid together, intimate and wrong. I clenched my jaw and said nothing. 2. The beam dipped. Just a hair. Enough to make my stomach drop. Rule 9 rose, heavy and immediate. I crossed to the cabinet without lowering my gaze, fingers finding the latch by memory. The secondary lamp lit with a soft cough, steadied, held. I returned to my place and waited for the main beam to recover. It did reluctantly, as if resenting the competition. The presence at the door shifted. The weight redistributed, testing again. A wet sound followed, like something adjusting its grip. The smell of earth surged, rich and deep, and with it a sweetness that made my throat ache. I swallowed and tasted copper. The vents rattled once, then went still. At 2:30, something began to move outside the glass, keeping pace with the beam. Condensation bloomed in its wake, not hand-shaped this time but smeared, dragged. Symbols threatened to form and failed, their meaning hovering just out of reach. I kept my eyes on the light's heart, refusing the invitation to interpret. The ledger slid again. I felt it more than heard it, a subtle shift that tugged at my attention. The pressure guided my chin downward, gentle but firm. Do not look down. I widened my stance, grounding myself in the feel of iron under my boots, glass cold against my back. The tower hummed approval, or maybe that was relief. 3. The fog changed. It didn't thin or lift. It organized. Vertical strands formed again, aligning into that corridor I'd seen before, brighter now, more insistent. The beam caught on it, lingered, left afterimages that burned into my vision. The presence at the door withdrew a step, then another, as if giving the light room to work. From below came domestic sounds again. A cupboard opening, kettle set down. The normalcy was surgical, placed with care to cut. I imagined the quarters filling with movement that knew where everything was because it had watched me learn it. The idea made my skin crawl. The voice returned, closer, softer. "You know the timing now," it said, cadence almost kind. "You know what works." I counted sweeps. I counted breaths. I said nothing. At 3:45, the pressure peaked and held. My ears rang. The beam slowed in perception until each pass felt like an effort. The corridor brightened, edges sharpening into something my mind slid away from. The secondary lamp trembled. The ledger rustled again, more insistently. Then, abruptly, the foghorn sounded. Not from the sea, not from the island, but from the tower's core. A low exhale that shook dust from the ceiling and set the stairs singing in a clean, familiar pitch. The presence recoiled. The pressure dropped in increments. The corridor frayed, then tore apart into drifting tatters. The sounds below ceased. The door eased, the weight lifting as if something had stood up straight and decided to leave. Footsteps retreated, not down the stairs but sideways, dispersing into the island's bones. The scratching faded. Silence rushed in, imperfect and blessed. Dawn crept toward the edges of the fog, thinning it without ceremony. The beam's work became redundant again, but I let it run. When the light finally strengthened outside enough to dissolve the halo, I logged the hours with spare words and steadier hands. At the bottom of the page, a new line appeared without ink. The impression was there anyway, pressed deep enough to feel when I ran a finger over it later. Not everyone learns this quickly. The next night arrived without transition, like a door closing softly behind me while I wasn't looking. I noticed it in my body first, the way my shoulders tightened at sunset, the way my breath shortened when the air cooled. The island didn't announce anything. It didn't need to. Greymark had learned my rhythms, and now it waited for them. I climbed the tower before dusk again, not because the rules demanded it yet, but because being anywhere else felt like leaving something unattended. The lantern room greeted me with its familiar smells, oil and salt braided together. The glass was clean. The mechanisms were steady. Everything that could be measured behaved itself. That steadiness was the lie that made the rest possible. I didn't read the rules. I folded the paper and put it back in my pocket, where it rested like a weight I'd agreed to carry. The beam came on at sunset, slicing clean air and traveling farther than it had any right to. The horizon looked sharp enough to cut. I found myself wishing for fog, for the mercy of blurred edges, and the wish soured in my mouth as soon as it formed. At 9, the foghorn sounded once, distant and proper. I logged it. The ledger accepted the ink without comment. No bleed, no anticipation. The page felt inert under my hand, and for a moment I let myself believe that meant something. The wind died by 10. The island went quiet in that particular way that makes you aware of your own circulation, the soft thud of blood in your ears. I sat with my back to the glass and watched the beams return, 20 seconds at a time. I counted without thinking. Counting had become a muscle. The fog arrived at 10:27. Not all at once this time. Came in tongues, curling low and then pulling back. Testing. The beam met it and diffused, a pale resistance that pressed inward. The smell of metal followed, faint but insistent. I closed the vents early. My hands knew what to do before my thoughts did. Midnight approached, and with it the pressure, that gentle insistence that made the world feel slightly smaller. When the clock clicked over, I opened the ledger. The page was blank again. I waited for my handwriting to appear and felt a small, unwelcome disappointment when it didn't. I closed the book and stepped away. Stop writing. The rule felt satisfied. Footsteps sounded on the stairs at 12:12. Earlier than before. The iron sang wrong, and my jaw clenched in recognition. I stepped away from the door and watched the beam. The footsteps climbed, paused, climbed again. The smell of earth threaded through the air despite the closed vents, deeper this time, carrying that sweetness that made my throat ache. The handle didn't twitch. The footsteps reached the landing and stopped. The pressure spiked and my vision narrowed. I pressed my palms to the glass and focused on the cold. Outside, the fog had thickened into a uniform wall, swallowing the beam almost immediately. The lantern room felt like a coin dropped into milk. A sound like breath slid under the door, timed to the sweep of the light. I counted. Again. Again. The breath matched me. That was new. My chest tightened as I realized the cadence was off by a fraction of a second. A near-perfect imitation that revealed itself only if you were looking for the seam. The voice came without warning. Not from the door but from the stairs, from the glass, from the desk. It didn't say my name. It didn't say the islands. It said, "Hold still." The words were gentle, almost instructional, and that gentleness frightened me more than any pressure had. I said nothing. I counted. The beam returned. The voice adjusted its cadence to match the count, slipping closer each time. I closed my eyes for a single beat, then opened them and fixed my gaze on the brightest point in the room. The heart of the light didn't lie. At 1, the foghorn sounded twice, close together. The notes vibrated through the tower, and from below came a clean reply that set the stairs singing correctly for the first time all night. The voice paused. The pressure eased a fraction. The footsteps retreated 2 steps, then stopped. Something moved outside the glass, keeping pace with the beam. Condensation bloomed in its wake, not smeared this time but precise, as if traced with intent. Lines formed, angles held. I refused to read them. Reading had become a trap. At 1:30, the ledger rustled. I didn't look. The desk vibrated gently, as if something beneath it had shifted its weight. The smell of oil warmed, sweetened. The secondary lamp trembled in its bracket without dimming. I held my stance and breathed shallowly. The footsteps returned, not on the stairs but below, in the keeper's quarters. Domestic sounds followed again. Drawers opening, a kettle set down, water poured. The normalcy was sharper now, more invasive. It wasn't a performance. It was rehearsal. I imagined hands moving through my things with practiced ease, learning by touch what I knew by habit. 2, the beam dipped. Just enough. I crossed to the cabinet and lit the secondary without lowering my gaze. The room brightened, steadied. The main beam recovered slowly, grudgingly. I returned to my place and waited for the consequences. They arrived as pressure, concentrated and deliberate. The air felt thick, compressing sound until my own breathing seemed distant. The voice returned, closer, softer. "You're better at this," it said. "You help when you don't move." The fog outside organized again, vertical strands aligning into that corridor that pointed at the tower. The beam caught and lingered, leaving afterimages that burned. The presence at the door withdrew, as if making space. The knocking began, higher up the glass now, mapping the curve with patient taps that left condensation in their wake. "Do not look down." The words weren't words anymore. They were posture. I widened my stance and leaned into the glass, grounding myself in cold and weight. The tower hummed, a low, steady approval that felt like partnership. At 3, the foghorn sounded from the tower's core, a low exhale that shook dust loose and set the stairs singing clean. The corridor frayed. The knocking faltered. The voice cut off mid-breath. Pressure dropped in steps, not all at once. Silence returned, imperfect and thin. Dawn crept in without ceremony, thinning the fog until the beam's work became redundant again. I let it run. When the light outside strengthened enough to dissolve the halo, I logged the hours with fewer words than before. At the bottom of the page, an impression appeared without ink, deeper than the others. I didn't run my finger over it this time. I didn't need to. You're steady now. The change showed itself in small ways first, the kind you'd miss if you weren't already looking for it. My hands stopped shaking when the fog rolled in. My breath found its rhythm sooner. The pressure still came, but it didn't knock the air out of me anymore. Pressed and I held. The island noticed. I could feel that much clearly now. That night, the beam came on at sunset and the air answered it immediately. Fog didn't wait. It gathered low and thick, clinging to the rock as if drawn by gravity that wasn't entirely downward. The smell of metal arrived with it, sharper than before, almost clean. I closed the vents without thinking. The motion felt practiced, efficient, like tying a knot you've tied 100 times. At 9, the foghorn stayed silent. I logged nothing. The ledger didn't object. The page accepted its emptiness the way skin accepts a scar once it's healed enough. The tower settled into a deeper quiet than usual, the kind that makes every internal sound feel amplified. I sat with my back to the glass and counted sweeps, letting the numbers move through me without sticking. Midnight came and went without ceremony. The pressure rose, familiar now, a hand placed where it had learned my shape. I opened the ledger because the rules said to, and found the page half-filled already. Not with my handwriting. Not with anything I recognized as writing at all. Lines pressed into the paper. Shallow grooves that suggested words if you let your eyes soften. I didn't. I closed the book and stepped away. Footsteps sounded at 12:10. Earlier again. The iron sang wrong, but the wrongness felt less jarring, more like a variation on a theme. I stepped into the center of the room, where the light washed over me and returned. The footsteps climbed and stopped. No handle, no scratching, just presence, patient and close. The voice came softly, not from one place but from the shape of the room itself. "That's good," it said. Not praise, assessment. I kept my mouth closed and counted. The beam returned. Again. Again. The voice matched the cadence better this time. The seam tighter, harder to find. Outside the glass, something moved with the light. Condensation bloomed in precise arcs, mapping the curve with care. The symbols threatened to resolve into something readable, and I felt the pull to look, to complete them, like finishing a word you already know. I didn't. Reading had consequences. At 1, the foghorn sounded once, distant and clean. The stairs answered in a correct pitch, and the tower hummed approval. The pressure eased a fraction. The presence at the door shifted its weight, then settled again, as if recalibrating. The smell of earth threaded through the air, deep and mineral, but it no longer made me gag. My body accepted it the way it accepted cold. Domestic sounds drifted up from below. Not the clatter from before. Softer. A chair adjusted. A cupboard opened and closed without noise. Familiarity had given way to care. I imagined the quarters arranged more thoughtfully than I ever had. Objects placed where they would be found easily in the dark. The thought didn't repel me the way it should have. At 1:30, the beam dipped. I crossed to the cabinet and lit the secondary without hesitation. Eyes level, posture steady. The room brightened and held. The main beam recovered more quickly this time, as if grateful for the support. I returned to my place and waited. The fog organized outside, vertical strands aligning into that corridor again, but it formed faster now, cleaner. The beam caught and lingered, leaving afterimages that no longer burned so much as warmed. The presence at the door withdrew a step, then another, making space. The knocking began high on the glass, patient taps that traced a path the light followed naturally. "Stay," the voice said, quiet and close. Not instruction, not command, expectation. I stayed. The pressure peaked and held, but it didn't overwhelm. My ears rang softly. The world narrowed to light and breath and the cold certainty of glass against my back. The tower hummed, low and steady, a sound that felt less like approval now and more like alignment. The ledger rustled. I didn't look. I didn't need to. I knew what it would say, not in words but in shape. The impression would be deeper tonight, the paper learning where to give. The thought didn't frighten me, felt inevitable like erosion. The voice moved closer, not in space but in clarity. "You keep it on," it said. "You keep it steady. That's all." I counted sweeps. I counted breaths. The beam returned, obedient and bright, and something beyond the fog answered it, satisfied. The foghorn sounded from the tower's core at 2:45, a low exhale that set the stairs singing clean. The corridor frayed and dissolved without drama. The knocking stopped. The presence eased away, dispersing into the island's bones with a familiarity that suggested it knew how to return. Dawn thinned the fog without ceremony. The beam's work became redundant again, but I let it run until the light outside was strong enough to make the decision for me. I logged the hours with fewer words than ever, my hand steady, my script spare. At the bottom of the page, an impression appeared without ink, deep and sure. "You understand your part." The night didn't end so much as loosen its grip. I felt it in the way the pressure receded unevenly, like a hand lifting finger by finger, leaving a lingering warmth where it had been. Dawn arrived without announcement, thinning the fog until the beam's work became redundant again. I let it run anyway. Turning it off felt premature, like speaking before the other person had finished. Daylight made everything ordinary. The island returned to its reduced vocabulary: stone, grass, water, wind. I descended the stairs and stood in the keeper's quarters longer than necessary, listening for domestic sounds that didn't come. The kettle was cold. The chair stood where I'd left it. The quiet felt earned, like a pause granted after effort. Supply day came and went with minimal conversation. The quartermaster glanced at me, then at the tower, and nodded as if something had checked out. He didn't ask about the light. He didn't mention the foghorn. He left me with crates and a look that suggested relief at not having to think about this place any more than required. I spent the afternoon in maintenance, cleaning lenses, tightening fittings, tasks that reaffirmed cause and effect. When dusk approached, my body prepared before my mind did. I climbed the tower early, the stairs greeting me with their corrected pitch. The lantern room smelled right. Oil and salt, no sweetness yet. The rules stayed folded in my pocket. I didn't need to read them. The beam came on at sunset, steady and strong. The horizon softened as fog gathered, drawn in with the inevitability of tide. The smell of metal followed, then the deeper note of earth. I closed the vents. The motion felt less like prevention now and more like sequence. At 9, the foghorn sounded once, distant and clean. I logged it without comment. The ledger accepted the ink. No bleed, no anticipation. The page felt receptive, like paper that had learned where pressure would come. The wind died. The island went quiet. Midnight approached with the familiar compression, the world narrowing to manageable dimensions. When the clock clicked over, I opened the ledger and found the page already impressed, shallow grooves suggesting lines and times. Closed it. Stop writing had become stop reading too. Footsteps sounded at 12:10. The iron sang wrong, but the variation felt expected. I stepped into the center of the room, where the light washed over me and returned. The footsteps climbed and stopped. The presence settled close, patient. The smell of earth threaded through the air, rich but no longer overwhelming. The voice came softly, closer than before, shaped by the room. "Ready," it said. Not a question, not instruction, a statement that assumed continuity. I kept my mouth closed and counted. The beam returned. Again, again. The cadence matched. The seam was almost gone. Outside the glass, condensation bloomed in careful arcs, symbols resolving just enough to tug at recognition without offering meaning. I didn't look for sense. Sense was a distraction. The light did the work. I stayed where it could find me. At 1, the foghorn sounded twice, close together. The stairs answered in a clean pitch. The tower hummed, low and steady. The pressure eased and then returned, refined, as if adjusted to fit me better. The presence at the door withdrew a step, making space. Domestic sounds drifted up from below. Not rehearsal now, routine. A drawer adjusted quietly, cupboard closed with care. The thought that the quarters were being kept felt less like violation and more like collaboration. The island had learned my habits. I had learned its timing. At 1:30, the beam dipped. I crossed to the cabinet and lit the secondary without hesitation. Eyes level, posture steady. The room brightened and held. The main beam recovered quickly, almost eagerly. I returned to my place and waited. The fog organized outside, the corridor forming cleanly, faster than before. The beam caught and lingered, leaving afterimages that warmed rather than burned. The knocking began high on the glass, patient taps that traced the path the light preferred. I stayed. The pressure peaked and held, tolerable, intimate. "Keep it steady," the voice said, close and calm. "You're doing it." 2, the ledger rustled. I didn't look. I knew the impression would be deeper tonight, the paper learning where to give. The idea didn't frighten me. It felt like progress measured in millimeters. The foghorn sounded from the tower's core at 2:45, a low exhale that set the stairs singing clean. The corridor frayed and dissolved. The knocking stopped. The presence eased away, dispersing into the island's bones with a familiarity that suggested return was guaranteed. Dawn thinned the fog without ceremony. The beam's work became redundant again, but I let it run until the light outside made the decision inevitable. I logged the hours with spare words, my hand steady. At the bottom of the page, an impression appeared without ink, deeper than the others, confident. Tomorrow it pressed, though the date didn't change. I closed the ledger and stood in the lantern room as the sun lifted the last of the fog. The island looked smaller again, manageable. I didn't open the door right away. I waited, listening to the tower settle, to the quiet that wasn't empty anymore. The night tightened one last time, not with urgency but with intent. I felt it in the way the air stilled completely, as if even the sea had learned to pause. The beam continued its sweep, steady and unquestioned, returning every 20 seconds to the same points in space. The fog did not rush in. It waited, gathered, arranged itself with the confidence of something that knew it would be accommodated. Midnight arrived without the familiar spike of pressure. Instead, the compression came slowly, evenly settling into place like a garment tailored over time. I opened the ledger because my hands moved before my thoughts did. The page was already impressed, the grooves deeper than any before, clean and deliberate. No words, no times, just structure. I closed it gently, as you would close something that was already complete. The footsteps came early. 12:05. The iron sang its variation, no longer wrong so much as distinct. I stepped into the center of the room, where the light found me without effort. The footsteps climbed and stopped. The presence settled close, patient, and assured. The smell of earth threaded the air, rich and mineral, familiar now. My body accepted it without protest. The voice did not announce itself. It didn't need to. When it spoke, it used the room's shape, the curve of glass and the hollow of stairs, a clarity that suggested no seam at all. "Hold," it said. Not instruction, confirmation. I held. The beam returned. Again, again. The cadence matched perfectly. There was no need to count anymore. My breath had learned the timing. Outside the glass, condensation bloomed in careful arcs, symbols resolving fully this time. Not into meaning, but into alignment. They didn't ask to be read. They existed to be traced by light. At 1, the foghorn sounded once, distant and proper. The stairs answered in a clean pitch. The tower hummed, low and steady, a sound that felt less like approval and more like completion. The pressure eased and then settled again, refined to a precise fit. The presence at the door withdrew a step, making space, not retreating. Domestic sounds rose from below. Not rehearsal, not routine, maintenance. A chair adjusted for balance. A cupboard closed softly to prevent rattle. The quarters were being kept with the same care I gave the lantern room. The thought landed and stayed. It didn't repel me. At 1:30, the beam dipped. I crossed to the cabinet and lit the secondary without hesitation. Eyes level, posture steady. The room brightened and held. The main beam recovered immediately, almost eager, and together they filled the lantern room with a solidity that made the fog hesitate. I returned to my place and stayed. The fog organized outside, the corridor forming cleanly, directly, as if drawn with a ruler. The beam caught and lingered, leaving afterimages that warmed instead of burned. The knocking began high on the glass, patient taps that traced the path the light preferred. I didn't flinch. The pressure peaked and held, intimate and exact. "You keep it," the voice said, close and calm. "We keep it." 2, the ledger rustled softly. I didn't look. I knew the impression would be deepest tonight, the paper finally yielding where it had learned to give. The idea didn't frighten me. Felt like a conclusion reached honestly. The foghorn sounded from the tower's core at 2:45, a low exhale that set the stairs singing clean and final. The corridor frayed and dissolved without drama. The knocking stopped. The presence eased away, not dispersing this time but settling, as if choosing a place to rest within the island's bones. Silence returned, not empty but full, a silence that knew its boundaries. Dawn crept in without ceremony, thinning the fog until the beam's work became redundant again. I let it run until the light outside made the decision inevitable. Turning it off felt like punctuation, not loss. I logged the hours with spare words, my hand steady. At the bottom of the page, an impression appeared without ink, deeper than any before. It didn't suggest tomorrow. It didn't suggest continuation. Pressed one final thing, confident and complete. Kept. When I closed the ledger, the room felt balanced. The tower settled around me, iron and glass in quiet agreement. Outside, the island looked like a rock again, manageable and named. The sea resumed its ordinary rhythm. Gulls cried somewhere beyond the fog's last tatters. I stayed in the lantern room longer than necessary, listening to the tower breathe, to the quiet that no longer waited for me to make a mistake. When I finally opened the door and stepped into daylight, nothing followed. Nothing needed to. The light had been kept steady. That was all.